You are listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96 with Melinda Francis, Norman Richmond, Lisa Watson on the buttons, and we just heard the Jazz Zone with T.N. Providence, and T.N. Providence was doing part of his, I guess he just closed with his tribute to the OJs, and one of the OJs, Walter Williams, has a 4 or a 5 octave voice, and we just lost Andy Bay, a great vocalist. Also, he was the younger brother of Salome and Geraldine Bay, and Andy Bay was openly gay, a musician who don't want to spend too much time on this, but it's kind of important. His father, Andrew Weidman, was a member of the Moorish American Science Temple, and he went on to become a Sunni Muslim. And according to Salome Bay, Malcolm X always talked about he was the first African American Negro at the time to make Hajj, and Salome Bay says that her father made Hajj, before Malcolm. And as much as I love Malcolm, I know there were other people, Black people from America, who made Hajj as well. And Dr. Gerald Horne, we're going to be speaking to Dr. Gerald Horne right now. And how are you doing, sir?
Oh, sorry, it's all good.
We have a lot to talk about today, my good friend. I guess the most burning question on people where you are and on this side, in this part of the world, is the Canadian elections, and we are dying to hear your analysis.
Well, as many in the audience already know, the Liberal Party, led by Mark Carney, a former leader of the Bank of England, the Bank of Canada, an investment banker, ties to Goldman Sachs, the notorious Wall Street firm, prevailed. And unfortunately, the totals for the Social Democrats, speaking of the New Democratic Party, the NDP, went down. Ditto for the Bloc Québécois. They went down, as many of their members said that they were lending their votes to the Liberals in order to block the Conservatives. And of course, Jagmeet Singh, the leader of the NDP, resigned, not least because he lost his seat. And I think that what these totals reflect is that already you see that the United States is pushing Canada to the right, even before the new Carney administration gathers steam. That is to say, because of the fear of Trumpism, you saw a desertion of parties to the left. And so in some ways, Canada is evolving towards a US-style two-party system, which I dare say has not been in the best interest of the poor and working class of the United States. I doubt if it'll be in the best interest of the poor and working class of Canada. I should also say that I understand why members of the Greens and New Democratic Party and the Bloc decided to throw in their lot with the Liberals, but I'm not optimistic about the ability of the Liberals to craft a foreign policy in the best interests of Canada's majority. As we've mentioned many times in the past, they have negative to complicated relations with the United States, Russia, China, and India. It would make sense for them to try to make deals with China in particular because of China's contradictions to the United States of America. And also, this is perhaps a part of good news for Canada, is that because of the trade war with the United States, Canada increasingly Canada increasingly is the recipient of goods from China that are meant for the United States of America. In other words, Chinese vessels are dodging the Los Angeles Long Beach port, which has boomed in recent years because of the China trade, and instead are going to Vancouver, for example. But in any case, during his run for office, Mr. Carney pointed to China as being a major antagonist of Canada, even though it's the United States that's threatening to snuff out Canadian sovereignty. Similarly, as I mentioned a few weeks ago, the prominent ultra-rightist Preston Manning from the Prairie Provinces, he wrote an article now notorious in the Globe and Mail of Toronto, suggesting that if the Liberals lose, then Alberta would seek to secede from Canada. Ironically, what might be a stumbling block in the path of secession is that the First Nations, the Indigenous of Alberta, and also Saskatchewan, I should add in all fairness, have suggested that they are not in favor of secession, and they have, it seems, legal rights to block not only secession, but perhaps even a referendum. And it would be ironic indeed if the First Nations prevented the breakup of this particular nation. We should also mention something else, which is that our friends on the left in the United States, they have shied away from doing comparative analyses of the United States with other settler regimes. Now, obviously, the obvious comparison is with Canada. And if you look at the history and the trajectory of Canada and the United States, well, both were based upon indigenous dispossession, although I think it's fair to say, as scholars have noted, although this is a very dicey comment to make because we're talking about two tragedies, but still, having said that, the United States unleashed military force against the indigenous population south of the border in the United States of America, not to the same degree north of the border, that is to say, in Canada itself. The major distinction between Canada and the United States is that the United States engaged in mass enslavement of Africans, which has left in its wake a Black population of 13 to 14% with unresolved grievances. And I dare say that if you were to drill down in terms of plumbing the differences between Canada and the United States, with Canada having socialized health care, for example, and a national minimum wage, for example, and other kinds of social welfare benefits that people in the United States can only dream of. And when I say that, people in Canada get nervous because they think I'm giving Canada too much credit. But I'm only comparing it to the United States of America. I'm not comparing it to nirvana or heaven. And basically, any country would look positive being compared to the United States of America. Keep that firmly in mind, this concept of relativity. But in any case, the major difference is that the fractured working class of the United States of America, because of having at one time a gigantic sector of unpaid workers, otherwise known as slaves, is a major distinguishing factor, and that continues to resonate to this very day. I would also say something else that I've been mentioning quite a bit of late, and that is republicanism. Both are capitalist countries, but Canada is not a republic, which means that rather shortly, the titular head of state, King Charles III, is flying to Ottawa to give the throne speech. Now, we know that this is in some sense a technicality, but if you look at the trajectory of republicanism in the United States of America, what you have seen is that the untrammeled and divine right of monarchs was replaced in the first instance by the untrammeled and, quote, divine, unquote, right of propertied men of European descent. And during the Jacksonian era, the era of President Andrew Jackson 200 years ago, the remit was expanded to include non-propertied men of European descent, which helps to accelerate the dispossession of the indigenous population, the so-called Indian Removal Act, for example. And the United States is still laboring under the toxic legacy of this perversion of republicanism, because many states declare themselves to be Republican, be it the Black Republic in Haiti, the Democratic Republic of Congo, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, the People's Republic of China, or the erstwhile Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. But republicanism got off to a horrible start in North America with the United States. And what makes it even more troublesome is that this has hardly been recognized by people in the United States, even as we're staring down the barrel of fascism. You have people on the left, they continue to act like this is the 1930s. They only need to update their ideology or their way of looking at the country. And then, of course, another difference is the linguistic question. As has once been said with regard to Quebec, the predominantly French-speaking province, bosses speak English, workers speak French. Now, that has evolved, to put it mildly, but the issue here is that the kind of white supremacy that you have in the United States, turbocharged by republicanism, has been complicated and complexified by the Quebec question. And once again, sadly and tragically, we don't have organized forces in the United States, nor Canada for that matter, that make these kinds of comparisons that would help us to understand what path we should go forward. And we're going to talk shortly about the Australian elections, and that opens up another mode of comparison, because once again, just as in Canada, where Trump was a major issue and the Tories, the conservatives, were not able to distance themselves successfully from Mr. Trump. At one point, the conservative slogan was Canada First, which was mimicking America First. Likewise, in Australia, down under, the continental-sized island with a population of only about 25 million, compared to, say, 41 million in the United States and 335 million in 41 million in Canada, 335 million in the United States of America. Likewise, there are similarities to be made with regard to all three nations, all offspring of London, all predominantly English speaking, all involved in dispossession of the indigenous. However, once again, Australia did not have, as you have had in the United States, this mass enslavement of Africans, which I think is the factor that helps to shed light on, once again, why it was that in the Australian elections yesterday, the conservative forces went down to defeat. The party that was non-conservative, the center-left alliance of Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, prevailed. And Trumpism was a major factor because Australian economy is heavily dependent upon the Chinese economy. I recall 2 decades ago, I was in Australia doing research on the book that eventuated as the White Pacific, U.S. Imperialism and Black Slavery in the South Seas after the Civil War. And I was struck and stunned looking out of my hotel window in Sydney and seeing rail cars as far as the eye can see that were scooping minerals out of the soil, putting them in these rail cars, and then putting them on ships to be shipped to China. And that helped to goose the Chinese economy. And so once again, we see that Trumpism has not traveled well beyond the borders of the United States of America, even to countries as similar to the United States as Canada and Australia. And to repeat, I think the major difference with regard to these settler colonial regimes, both based upon, or all three based upon indigenous dispossession, is one, that only one is Republican, because King Charles III is still technically the head of state in Australia as well. And then secondly, only one, the United States of America, had this mass enslavement of Africans, an unpaid sector of the working class, whose descendants still have unresolved grievances, and whose presence allows, or at least serves as a pretext for class collaboration amongst a good deal of the settler descendant working class. In any case, we in the United States are facing a very difficult struggle ahead. The good news is that you can have fascism in one country, to be sure. On the other hand, fascism's route ahead would be smoother if the right wing had prevailed in the elections in Canada and if the right wing had prevailed in the elections in Australia. I should also say that we're not out of the woods yet, because you have neo-fascists in power in Italy under Prime Minister Meloni, the Nazi-curious Alternative for Germany party in Berlin is rising steadily. In Great Britain, in the local elections, the Reform Party under Nigel Farage did quite well, wounding both the Tories and the Labour Party. He, of course, is a close comrade of Mr. Trump, and in fact, has campaigned alongside Mr. Trump in, of all places, Mississippi, for example. So we're not out of the woods yet by any means. On the other hand, it's likely a step forward, once again, that the right did not triumph in Canada nor in Australia.
Talking to Dr. Gerald Horne before I turn it over to Melinda, I want to ask you a question of how much do you attribute the fact that the slave question of slavery in Canada, the cotton couldn't be grown in Canada. How much of that is a factor in terms of the slavery question in Canada versus the USA?
Well, sure. But I mean, the reality is you did not have mass enslavement. As I keep repeating almost every week, the founding father of British Columbia, where I'm now sitting, was a man of African ancestry, Sir James Douglas. As a matter of fact, in the book I'm going to write, it's going to be quite remarkable to note that in Oregon, the US state, they banned the presence of any people of African descent. Now, it turns out, as I will write, that they thought that they had their hands full dealing with the indigenous population. They thought that Black people would ally with the indigenous, and so they wanted to keep Black people away from Oregon by any means necessary. And so that meant that if Sir James Douglas had been captured in war, and of course there was bitter conflict between the United States nationals on the south side of the border and Canadian nationals, he could have wound up being flogged, because the law said that if any people of African descent, particularly mulattoes, to use their term, and that you could describe Mr. Douglas or Sir James as a mulatto, that they could be flogged, for example. And so another interesting aspect of the history of this region is that I had thought that the Comanches of Texas were the most fearsome indigenous warriors until I started studying the indigenous of what is now the state of Washington in particular, because it's noteworthy that in the recollections of these folks, these settlers in the state of Washington, they were petrified, because what would happen is that the indigenous warriors would come in on canoes, dozens of canoes with the indigenous armed to the teeth, and then they chase the settlers out of what is now Seattle. Seattle, of course, is named after an indigenous chief, speaking of Chief Seattle. And interestingly enough, also complicating the settler colonialism in this part of North America is that for the longest, the indigenous could play up on the contradictions between the Europeans, because you not only had Britain and the United States, you had Russia until 1867 in Alaska. And the so-called Northern Indians, as they were called, would oftentimes sail in to what is now Seattle, backed by Russia. So the challenges out here were tremendous. But yes, to reflect on your question, there are many reasons why mass enslavement of Africans did not prevail north of the border.
And Melinda has some questions.
Yeah, let's go to the Sahel states and Morocco.
Well, Burkina Faso is getting a lot of publicity nowadays, which is good. Ibrahim Traore, the leader of that embattled nation. However, what's happened recently is that the Sahel states, all of whom are landlocked, speaking of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, they were seeking an outlet to the sea. And so they cut a deal with Morocco, which has complicated relations with its neighbor, Algeria, that stretches back decades, if not longer. Algeria also has complicated relations with the former colonial master that is France. Morocco, recall, was one of the signatories to the so-called Abraham Accords, which in many ways was a sellout to Mr. Trump insofar as it involved de facto recognition of Israel. And what I fear further is that this new deal between the Sahel states and Morocco will not only complicate relations with Algeria to their detriment, but also it may complicate their relations with the Polisario of Western Sahara. Recall that Western Sahara had been colonized by the Spanish up until the overthrow of fascism in 1975. And at that point, Morocco moved in. Algeria supports Polisario. Morocco does not. Now the question becomes, with the Sahel states basically engaging with Morocco, will they follow Morocco with regard to its anti-Polisario claims? If so, will that ultimately weaken the Sahel states, which already are facing challenges, to use that euphemism, from ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, led by Nigeria, facing challenges from Cote d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast, another stalwart member of ECOWAS. And we all know that US imperialism, despite this recent news account about it pulling embassies and consulates out of Africa, there has been little talk thus far about pulling AFRICOM, the African Command, the Pentagon's armed wing in Africa, out of the continent. And of course, the leader of AFRICOM, a Black American by the name of Michael Langley, has been making very threatening noises about the Sahel states. We all know about the religious insurgencies in all three of those states, with it attaining fever pitch in both Mali and Burkina Faso, and to a lesser degree in Niger, backed by US ally, the United Arab Emirates, which of course has been implicated in genocide in Sudan. So it's a very complicated diplomatic and political chessboard that the Sahel states are facing. And obviously, despite the obstacles in their path, they desperately need our solidarity and support.
You're listening to Diasporic Music. Herb Boyd is maybe the leading expert in North America on the Polisario, wouldn't you say? Herb Boyd of all kind of. Well, Herb has done a whole lot of work on books and a lot of things. Am I correct in saying, Herb Boyd, we should probably have Herb Boyd on to talk about that North African situation? What do you think?
Well, I endorse that proposal. I should also say that Democracy Now! And Amy Goodman, they paid sufficient attention to Polisario and the Western Sahara. And of course, there are a number of scholars as well who've done the same. It's a very complicated situation, made even more complex by the fact that Western Sahara is the main repository of phosphate, which is an element with regard to fertilizer being essential with regard to agriculture nowadays. Perhaps the price of phosphate will accelerate in light of the fact that China is disrupting, has had its relations with the United States disrupted. The United States was sending agricultural commodities to China. China will be looking now for other suppliers, and that then puts a premium on the use of fertilizer in Brazil, which is a nation that China will be looking towards. And of course, there's just a short hop, skip, and a jump across the Atlantic from Western Sahara to Brazil. So it's a very complicated situation. Although, once again, I'm pleased to see that Burkina Faso has broken through the media curtain, the media iron curtain, and is receiving favorable publicity, thankfully.
And I would just like to announce that after this show goes off, we are going to have a special on the Sahel alliance, the countries, and I think Chairman Omali Ishatella will be leading that discussion right after we go off the air. And could you talk about the India-Pakistan conflict? That's been a burning question for many decades. Could you talk about that?
Many decades indeed, ever since independence of both in August 1947. Kashmir is the battleground. Kashmir, at least a good part of it, is part of India, but that claim is challenged by Pakistan. The two nations have battled at least 3 times in recent decades over Kashmir. The triggering incident that has brought both nuclear armed nations to the brink of war once again is an incident in Kashmir described by New Delhi as, quote, terrorism, unquote, with a few dozen individuals slain. It's unclear how this situation will work itself out. For the last few days, Islamabad, Pakistan, has been claiming that they're about to be attacked by India. It has not happened yet. That does not mean it won't happen, but it does give an idea of the sensitivity of this potential conflict, and then the possibility that it will worsen relations between India and China, since China is a major armed supporter of Pakistan. That goes back decades to the Cold War period when Russia was a major armed supporter of India. I should also mention, and perhaps we can talk about this next week, that the United States may be in the midst, once again, of flip-flopping on Ukraine. And Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina, a Trump ally, is introducing legislation that would call for secondary sanctions against nations that deal with Russia. That would mean India and China in the first instance, since both have profited from their relations with Russia, given the boycott from the North Atlantic powers. And so there are those who are predicting, despite the calamity that it would bring, that another world war, World War III, is in the offing. If it does happen, and I trust that it will not, China, Russia, India, Pakistan, the United States will be in the crosshairs.
And you're listening to Diasporic Music. I think that is about it. Is there anything else you would like to add?
Well, only that we need more analysis of North America with the blinders off, because I don't think we can go on the way we have been proceeding with this rosy view of the origins of the United States of America, a rosy view, by the way, which has also captivated a good deal of the Canadian left, which really should know better.
What are your thoughts on publications like the rebel.com? Have you been able to access them?
Well, yeah, I, since I've been here, I have been following it, but I think I understand the issue of being anti-monarchy and pro-Republican, because in theory, that is a progressive point of view. The problem is you're a neighbor of an early Republican state where Republicanism has worked out horribly. So if you're going to be pro-Republican, you have to do an analysis that critiques Republicanism south of the border, and I have yet to see that from our friends in the Canadian left, even though the United States, this premier Republican nation, is now threatening to snuff out the sovereignty of Canada, have their insurance companies invade north of the border, and replace socialized healthcare with the pay or die system. So you would think that that alone would be sufficient impetus to do an agonizing reappraisal of the United States of America.
Well, this is the last question, but isn't in your research, haven't you found that, for example, someone like Norman Bethune, wasn't there a faction inside the CP, the Canadian CP, that was warning against what we're seeing today, or is that the case? Or do we need to do more?
Well, sure. Yeah. I mean, warning against U.S. I mean, look, the United States tried to take over Canada during the War of 1812. After they brought Russia's claims to Alaska in 1867, they tried to seize British Columbia. It has been an ever-present menace, that is to say, the United States vis-a-vis Canada. But you really have to go back to first principles. And that means going back to republicanism, and that means going back to mass enslavement of Africans.
All right. I guess with that, we'll see you next week, sir.
Good luck to you.
And Melinda Francis, is there anything else you'd like to add? Oh, wait.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.